Hello, today I'm with Siobhan, who's part of the Sustainable Investment team at LGT Wealth. Siobhan, could you just introduce yourself to our clients?
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you so much for having me. So I joined LGT Wealth Management about a year ago, actually to the day. And I joined from the UNPRI, which is the Principles for Responsible Investment, where I was covering 800 of the UK's asset and wealth managers. My role here spans all of our sustainable investment team, but I do focus on something called stewardship. So this is really thinking about how sustainable investment doesn't start and end with a sustainable decision at the outset, but rather we still try and help those companies improve their sustainability practices whilst we hold them, whether that's through fund managers, and we've been doing quite a lengthy engagement exercise with our fund managers, but also directly with the companies that we own in direct portfolios. So pushing them on things like diversity, environmental practices.
Okay, that's very interesting, thank you. Let's start at the beginning. What is sustainable investing?
Yeah, so everyone has a different definition, but I'll tell you how we view it. We view sustainable investing as a way to invest which considers non-financial information to try and help us to pick the best companies that are making outcomes for people and planet and ensuring that their products and services aren't necessarily harming the world. So we do this in a number of different ways, but just to explain how we start, we will do something called, or that was traditionally called, ethical investing or responsible investing, wherein we screen out certain companies. It's not our favorite approach, so I'll go into how we do it, but also how the industry does it. But traditionally, sustainable investing or ethical investing at the time was viewed as a way where we removed certain sin industries from portfolios. That could be tobacco, it could be weapons, it could be oil and gas, for example. And one of the big difficulties with that, as I'm sure you'll know and your clients will know, is that it removes the opportunity for certain companies that are maybe doing quite well in those sectors to add to performance. So we felt that it was a good starting point back in the 70s when it sort of emerged. But since then, we've gained a huge amount of data on environmental, social, and governance data points. So what you would traditionally call non-financial data points. And now we use that to filter every single company, every single fund manager, and pick the very best in each sector. There are some sectors we will still avoid for sustainable clients. We don't love thermal coal. We have a group-wide exclusion on thermal coal, and we have a group-wide exclusion on controversial weapons. That's for both sustainable and traditional portfolios. However, in sustainable portfolios, we don't like any animal testing. We don't love anything around alcohol. Adult entertainment is screened out, as well as gambling and tobacco.
Okay. You mentioned environmental, social and governance. What impact do you think investing with those things in mind will have in the short term, but also you hope for in the longer term?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think initially the idea was you weren't giving capital when you had ethical screens on portfolios, you weren't giving capital to the wrong companies. But I think we've come beyond that, where we want to be giving money to the right types of companies. One of the stats that I like to use is one by Make My Money Matter. They're an environmental campaigning group here in the UK. And what they say is that, as many of us do, we try and make small changes in our personal lives around sustainability. So we can go vegetarian, we can stop flying, we can swap our energy providers to renewable energy providers, for example. But something that's 21 times more powerful is swapping your pension or your investment portfolio to a sustainable pension, in terms of emissions, but also in terms of the good that you're doing towards the world.
Okay. I have a pension. I actually do invest sustainably. But for a lot of people, they will be concerned about maybe not achieving the sort of returns on their pensions that they would if they were investing in a more traditional manner. Can you allay those fears?
Yeah, I think so. Initially, and what you're speaking about, initially sustainable investing was something that excluded certain traditional, maybe sin stock industries. And when you do that, it means that you have a lot less upside. You're taking out full, maybe oil and gas sector, something that in the last couple of months have outperformed as a result of the Russia and Ukrainian crisis. But the way we approach sustainable investing is through a best-in-class approach, meaning for clients, that means we look at those individual data points on environmental policies, on how they're treating toxic waste, for example. We look at how companies are managing their supply chains. Do they have deforestation, or are they opting for renewable practices in their agricultural supply sources? We look at things like how they're managing their labor. So around sort of sick pay, that was a huge thing during COVID. And we look at the governance of the boards. So are their CEOs and chairs independent, or are they rather serving on many roles? And what is the CEO paid in comparison to the workers? And how has that changed with the cost of living? That's something we're keeping a close eye on. And by doing that, we don't necessarily have to exclude certain industries. The other thing we try and do is we try and find sustainable versions of the trends we're seeing in the markets. So I mentioned energy. Everyone picks up on oil and gas prices at the moment. But if you look at the S&P Clean Energy Index, which is an index which shows only renewable energy companies, that's continued to outperform. And energy, or that renewable energy, has been an area of our portfolio that has continued to outperform. So you can find sustainable trends even within which outperform despite market circumstances within sustainable portfolios. You have to just be looking and making sure you're not going into expensive companies or you're falling for bubbles. But those definitely do exist, and that's something that our team does a lot of work on.
Okay. You mentioned energy as a trend. Are you identifying any other trends in sort of the sustainable space?
Absolutely. So I think there's a lot of trends at the moment that are going towards renewable energy, and the drivers have been government policies. In the US, we had the Inflation Reduction Act. In the EU, we've had Repower EU. In China, we've had the Chinese Green Act, and Greening Japan is another one. They're all coincidentally and easily for me to remember, 330 billion. And these are long-term trends. China's about more around 6 months, but the rest of those are decade-long trends. So it is infrastructure for renewable energy. We're going to continue to see that as a way of safeguarding some of the cost of living crisis, some of these energy costs that are going up by moving to renewable energies. I think in the US, if you pick this Inflation Reduction Act, there's been some stats that say that if you invest in solar energy, you can be building a whole new solar farm and giving that energy away for free, and you'll still be making a profit because those tax credits are so high. So there's definitely a lot of opportunity here. We're also seeing a lot of opportunity, of course, in recycling and waste management. So I think the plastic crisis and everything that we're seeing in oceans is really quite scary around microplastics. We're seeing businesses that are creating extremely exciting polymers that you can add to plastic water bottles, meaning you can recycle them as many times as possible. This was something that wasn't possible a few years ago. We all know that aluminium is something that can be recycled a lot, so we're seeing businesses transform their packaging to use those products that are sort of infinitively recyclable. We're also seeing quite a lot around the electrification of fleets, of course, so continuing to have electric vehicles, giving all of these schemes, Repower EU and the IRA, are also giving credits to manufacturers of electric vehicles. And in the US, they've actually said those cars can't all be Teslas that are going for $100,000 US, but they actually are putting caps on the costs of these cars. So they do work out to be cheaper sometimes than their gas counterparts.
Okay, that'll make a difference. Is sustainable investing becoming mainstream, do you think? Are we at that stage yet?
You're asking me a question, I'm very biased.
Oh, that's fair enough.
I certainly think so. I think what we're seeing become mainstream, and this is something that we're looking for all of our fund managers to do, not just our sustainable fund managers, is for them to be looking at ESG risk. So looking at environmental, social, and governance risks, whether you're a sustainable portfolio or you're a conventional portfolio. We spoke about Russia and Ukraine. One of the things that we were very pleased to see is we had absolutely no Russian exposure in our portfolios before Russia invaded Ukraine. And that was really because we were looking at some of these social risks, some of these governance risks, and we just thought it wasn't the safest area to put money into sovereigns. We would like to see our managers across the floor do the same. What you're doing is you're identifying risk. I mean, of course, there's also opportunities that you can identify, But just by looking at that, what you're doing is safeguarding clients. So I think this ESG incorporation, that sort of these looking at these risks, is becoming much more mainstream. What we're seeing in the sustainable field is that more managers are going towards impact investing, where you're actually looking for more than just making sure you're not doing harm to the world, but actually trying to make good. So investing in things like renewable energy is great because it lowers carbon emissions. Investing in banks that offer microloans, for example, to farmers. Investing in products around biodiversity. We have a company in our portfolios that does, it makes these amazing sort of peat packages, which has worms and sort of naturally occurring enzymes so that farmers don't need to use pesticides and fertilizers to increase their yields. And then it also has the added benefit that the soil quality is still really good after sort of the end of the crop season. So all of these themes are sort of more impact investments, meaning they also look at the social and the environmental side of things. And I think that's where we're seeing the sustainable players go a little bit more. So
Okay.
I do think it's becoming more and more mainstream.
Good. Okay. One final question. It's probably very easy for a company to stick a green badge on something and say, look, we're meeting this or that requirement. What sort of checks are in place to prevent that happening? I think the expression is greenwashing.
Absolutely right. So I'll talk about what we do now, and I'll talk about what we're seeing coming in terms of regulation and how this may change. So at the moment, we do quite deep analysis on the companies and the fund managers. We've built an internal tool called the Smps. It's the wording we use internally. And what that tool does is it will look at 33 different data points. Depending on the sector, they'll be slightly different for each and every company. And we'll look at companies from their operations standpoint, but also from their products and services. We call it ESG versus impact. And the best example for that is a tobacco company, a Philip Morris, for example, could have really strong environmental practices. They could have low greenhouse gas emissions. They could pay their workers really well. So they'd have an excellent ESG score. But at the end of the day, their products and services have a huge detrimental effect on health. And so therefore, their impact score wouldn't be considered. We thought it was very important to consider the products and services so you have that well-rounded picture of a company. So we do that for each and every single holding in every fund in our portfolios. But then, and that gives us a score, it gives us a sort of good picture, how many companies are leaders to laggards, that sort of thing, and where can we spend time engaging, and speaking to the fund manager around how can they improve their practices. But importantly, given the amount of managers getting into the sustainable space, we thought it was very important to also look at the fund managers' practices. And that's through something that we call giving them an intentionality score or an integrity score, thinking about what does their team look like, how many sustainable investing experts do they have, what data points are they considering, how frequently are they looking at it. We look at controversies. So if Nestle has a huge scandal, how quickly has it been rectified, and how quickly did the manager write to Nestle as an investor and say, look at what has happened? And that comes into a second score. So we have those two elements of it. We have how is the fund manager acting and how much integrity does their sustainability practice have, but also alongside it, what do each and every individual holding look like? Is their fund purely sustainable, but the manager doesn't really care, it was an asset gathering exercise? Or do they both have, a really strong practice, really strong team, and their fund holdings reflect that practice?
I'm sure that level of research will be reassuring for our sustainable
It is.
investors.
I hope so. The other thing I was going to say is, so that's what we do at the moment. In terms of what's happening at the moment, the FCA has launched a consultation, which is maybe very boring to your clients, but I'll tell you about it because it's very exciting for us.
Okay.
It's called the Sustainable Disclosure Regulation Consultation, and it was titled Tackling Greenwashing. And what it does is it asks fund managers to add labels to their investment products. And if you use the term sustainable, if you use the terms ESG, if you use the term green, you are going to have to do significant reporting in line with those labels. To us, it's nothing really new. We have that type of reporting. It's something that we've been spending a lot of time on. But equally, I think it will start to change the way different managers are able to advertise and market their products. I think that's very important in terms of your clients. Many of them aren't sustainable investing experts, and they do have to rely on yourselves, on us, to do that work. So these labels and this scheme will mean that they're able to trust what they're reading, and trust the marketing reports that come across their email inboxes. So I think it's quite exciting from not a reporting perspective, but from the impact that it will have on the clients.
And the reassurance that it will provide.
Absolutely.
Siobhan, that's been really interesting. Thank you very much for your time today.
Thank you.